If you're looking for a holiday dress pattern, the Marostica midi dress is an elegant choice, perfect for parties and evening events this season. This pattern has a high statement collar with buttons at the back and an elasticated waist. I made it today in a stretch cotton sateen which drapes nicely and feels soft and silky. Print out this free pattern and let's sew it together. Here is the wrong side of my top back piece. I'm going to slash this material down the center back, along the line transferred from the pattern piece, from the top to the bottom of the line. We're going to finish the raw edges of this slashed portion using a rolled hem, pressing the raw edges to the wrong side by 1/4 inch on both sides of the slit, then tucking the raw edges underneath so you have a clean finish. Edge stitch along both folded inner edges all the way along the slit. I'm going to finish both raw shoulder edges with my serger for the back piece, as well as for the front piece. Then I'll place the front and back pieces right sides together at the shoulders and pin in place, sewing with a 1/2 inch seam allowance and pressing the seams open. Along the top edges of your front neckline, you have notches indicating where we're going to be starting and stopping our basting stitches. Baste with a 1/4 inch seam allowance from notch to notch, then pull those basting stitches to gather the front neckline. Place a front and a back armhole facing piece right sides together, aligning the center seam. Pin, sew with a 1/2 inch seam allowance and press the seam open. Doing this for both sets. I've applied interfacing to the wrong side of both of these attached facing pieces. Now I'm going to finish the bottom curved edge for both sets. Here are my front and back top pieces opened out away from each other at the shoulder seam. I'm going to place the corresponding facing piece right sides together with the armhole and pin in place, aligning the shoulder seams. Repeat to pin your opposite facing to the opposite armhole. Sew each of the facings in place from the back notch to the front notch with a 1/2 inch seam allowance on both sides. Then we're going to understitch both of the facings. Turn the facing over its seam allowance and sew the facing to the seam allowance underneath with about 1/8 inch seam allowance, repeating on both sides. Here's the facing and the armhole of the dress once again. I'm going to turn this facing underneath so that it's right sides together with the dress. At each of the outer edges of the facing, at the end of the stitches, I'm going to clip to the stitching line and not beyond. Now I'll take the side edges of the facing only and place the facing right sides together. Then pin that side seam of the facing from top to bottom. Then we can sew this bottom portion of the facing only from the notch to the bottom with a 1/2 inch seam allowance. Now I have that bottom section of the facing sewn and the front and back pieces are right sides together. Pin the side seam of the front and back piece only from the notch to the bottom. Now I'll sew this side seam of the dress from the notch to the bottom with a 1/2 inch seam allowance. Finish the raw edges together and press them toward the back. Turn your facing entirely to the inside. Then along the bottom of the facing at the side seam, we're going to sew the edge of the facing to the side seam to hold everything in place, just using a needle and thread. Repeat to secure the outer finished edge of the facing along the shoulder seam, hand stitching it to the seam allowance only. Follow all of those steps to complete both armholes and then give both armhole edges a good press. For the back neck button loops, I've cut a strip of fabric 1.5 inches by 6 inches. Now I'll fold this piece right sides together the long way. Sew the raw edges with a 1/4 inch seam allowance and then turn it right side out. Give this piece a good press, then cut it in half to form 2 equal button loops. I've applied interfacing to the wrong side of my neckband piece. I'm going to fold both of the button loops in half so that the short raw edges are side by side, and sandwich them in between one short edge of the collar. I'll fold the collar in half lengthwise right sides together, evenly spacing the button loops between the top fold and the bottom seam allowance. Also pin the opposite short edge. We're going to sew both of the side edges from the top fold with a 1/2 inch seam allowance, stopping a 1/2 inch away from the bottom raw edge. Then I'll trim the top corners and turn this piece right side out. Give the neckband piece a good press. Place one side of the bottom edge of the neckband right sides together with the neckline, from center back slit to center back slit. Then sew that one side of the neckband to the neckline with a 1/2 inch seam allowance from center back to center back. Now for the opposite unattached raw edge of the collar, we're going to fold it to the wrong side by 1/2 inch. Tucking that seam allowance under and pressing the seam allowance that we just sewed up toward the neckband. Now I'll place that folded edge of the neckband that I just pressed under right on top of the main stitching that we just sewed. And I'll pin it in place from the outside. Now that I have that pinned in place from the outside, and my pins are catching that inner folded edge of the neckband on the inside, I'll stitch in the ditch of the main neckband seam from one center back side to the other. Then I'll use a needle and thread to sew my buttons in place across from the button loops. Here's my front skirt piece, and I've gone ahead and finished the side edges on both sides using my serger. I've done the same to finish the side edges for the back piece as well. Now I'll place the front and back skirt pieces right sides together and pin the side seams. Sew each of the side seams from the top to the bottom with a 1/2 inch seam allowance. Press the seam open and repeat for both side seams. Now I'll sew basting stitches along the bottom of the bodice from side seam to side seam for the front and along the bottom of the back. Now I'll place the bottom of the bodice and the top of the skirt right sides together. Pin in place at the center front, center back, and the side seams, then ease the basted bodice to fit the top of the skirt. Then we'll sew the top of the skirt to the bottom of the bodice with a 1/2 inch seam allowance all the way around, finish the raw edges together, and press the seam up toward the bodice. Open the bodice and the skirt away from each other, and with that seam allowance pressed up toward the bodice, edge stitch along the finishing stitches of that seam allowance, leaving about an inch gap to insert the elastic. I've cut a piece of 1/4 inch elastic to a length 1 inch less than my waist measurement. I'll attach a small safety pin to one short end and lace it through the casing through the opening in my stitches. Overlap the two short ends of the elastic by about 1 inch, zigzag in place to secure. Pull your elastic entirely into the casing, and then close the gap in your stitches following the original stitching line. Along the bottom of the dress, you're going to form a rolled hem just as we did for the back slit opening at the beginning. I'm going to form a total hem allowance of 1/2 inch, then tuck that raw edge under by 1/4 inch for a nice finish along the bottom. I've gone ahead and pinned my hem all the way around. Now I'll edge stitch close to the upper inner fold all the way around. Thank you for watching this sew along. Make sure you subscribe to the channel so you don't miss future sewing tutorials, and I'll see you in the next video.